Well, it's been a long time since we've descended into the land of gloom and doom, but it looks like that's where we're going here. As showery rains move up the coast, low pressure forms offshore, and the onshore flow is going to keep us in some gloomy conditions, possibly into Saturday before weather conditions improve later in the weekend. And we've got a few other things going on. Severe weather in the Western Plains tonight, and we'll take a look at the long range in the tropics. That's all coming up right now on the Joe and Joe Weather Show podcast. And you can support the Joe and Joe Weather Show podcast by shopping on Amazon using the referral link that's pinned to the top of the chat board or is on the descriptor to this video. You get your stuff. Amazon throws us back a little coin out of their pocket, and they got deep pockets, but they don't throw out a whole lot of coin. And we appreciate the support. So do your shopping on Amazon and use our referral link. And I think it's probably a good idea that people get to see what we look like. There we go.
Yeah, I'm just
So,
looking at the chat board. Some interesting stuff, not necessarily weather related, going on. But in any case, yeah, it's been a while since we've descended into the land of gloom and doom. Actually, we'll probably be seeing a lot of clouds tomorrow, but precipitation wise, Joe, it doesn't look like we're going to see very much, at least locally in the tri state area, until probably sometime very late tomorrow night, and then carrying over into Thursday. And then, hit or miss type precipitation maybe for Friday. And as you mentioned, maybe even into the start of the weekend on Saturday. This is the transition weekend for the seasons. We transition into fall with the autumnal equinox on Sunday.
yeah, and it's, we just had, what was it, 9 days, 10, even today actually was a pretty decent day. It was no worse than partly sunny in most places. But you get an onshore flow like this. The other issue probably is going to be, well, with this full moon, you've got the autumnal equinox and all the rest of it. The tide cycles are running high, and this persistent onshore flow is probably going to. It's already creating some coastal flooding issues. I noticed that there are a few coastal flood advisories and some coastal flood statements that have been issued by various local offices along from southern New England down to southeastern Virginia, and that'll probably increase because we're not going to lose this onshore flow even when if weather conditions improve on Sunday. It's going to be thanks to a building big high in northeastern Canada, and that's just going to keep the flow onshore-ish even into next week.
Yeah, it's almost like a pattern you would see in the springtime, in let's say late March or April, where you get that northeasterly wind. And it looks like we're going to, as you said, Joe, continue with that right on into the upcoming weekend. So no sign of any kind of significant warming. I mean, if you're hoping for temperatures at or above 90, I think that's pretty well gone by the board, maybe for the rest of the season.
I think it is, as if judging from the way the pattern looks like it wants to evolve down the road, it's hard to imagine how how it's going to be able to get that warm, at least here in the east. Now that might be a different story out in the west because that's where the ridge is, but here in the east, that is, yeah, I think we're done with that. And very interesting in the longer range, the models, all three global models and their ensembles are all showing some sort of tropical storm development next week in the Caribbean and moving into the eastern Gulf of Mexico. And then there's all sorts of various fantasy tracks beyond that on all three of the models. So that's probably as far as we can go as far as figuring out what exactly it is we're going to be dealing with if we're going to wind up dealing with anything. But does look like the tropics seem to be maybe waking up again, or just waking up because they haven't really woken up very much.
Yeah.
But they may be waking up for this as we move through the second half of the month.
Yeah, it is. It's been relatively quiet compared to what we were told it was going to be like this particular tropical storm season. We haven't seen all that much, but it's not out of the question that as we come down the home stretch of September and into October, which in recent years has been a rather active month for tropical activity, that we could see a few, and don't rule out that possibility that we here in the Northeast, and especially so the Maritimes of Canada, Atlantic Canada, which has been kind of like it's almost as if they had a target on their back, so to speak. Quite a bit of that activity hitting up there, as opposed to the more southerly locations, the tropical locations. So we'll see how things pan out in the coming weeks. It could still turn out to be rather interesting.
All right. So, welcome to everybody on the chat board tonight. Welcome to those of you watching in the background on the Joe and Joe Weather Show podcast. We're here Sunday through Thursday at 7:35 p.m. and the occasional Friday and Saturday when there's a storm going on somewhere. But there's probably not going to be that issue coming for Friday, come Friday and Saturday. When we say storm, we mean something significant, not light rain or drizzle. But if we do add shows, we always let you know, and you can plan accordingly. If you like the show, hit the like button and do subscribe to my YouTube channel and turn your notifications on. By the way, you can also find us on various podcast sites in case you're in your car and you want to just listen to the Joe and Joe Weather Show podcast. We're on Spotify. We're on Google Podcasts, or at least they used to call it Google Podcasts. I think now they call it YouTube Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and a whole bunch of others. So we're there somewhere. It's hard to miss us. We're big everywhere. So on that note, watches and warnings tonight. We've got flash flood watches in southeastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina. Because they've been dealing with some heavier rains and some convective activity from the potential tropical cyclone that never became the tropical cyclone it had potential for. But the moisture from that is moving up the seaboard. We have coastal flood advisories and coastal flood statements, southern New Jersey, Delaware, eastern Virginia, also in southwestern Connecticut. They've got a coastal flood statement there, and I think you're probably going to see more of those in the coming days. Severe thunderstorm watches up for much of eastern New Mexico and eastern Colorado, northwest Kansas, western Nebraska, and southeastern Wyoming. And we've got various high wind watches that are up in that zone and in the western plains because we got a deep trough in the west. And this just for laughs. I mean, you look at California, and I'm looking at some of these advisories, Joe, that they've got up. So, they went from having excessive heat warnings and heat advisories back a week or so ago. Now they got frost advisories up in some of the counties in the Sierra Nevada. So that's just pretty much how it goes. And on the satellite tonight, again, the dry air in the Northeast just would not let go. And if you were, say, from central New Jersey, Northeast Pennsylvania, north and east, you actually had a pretty decent day today with no worse than partly sunny skies. But a lot of clouds down in Virginia, North Carolina. Not much convective activity, though. A few thunderstorms here and there. But we do have areas of rain. And you can see the spiraling back into eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina. That's actually where the low center that was off the Carolina coast is wound up. So what's coming up the coast is just sort of this arm of moisture that's lifting northeastward. And there's going to be a low that probably forms off the Delaware coast tomorrow into tomorrow night and Thursday that's going to hang around for a while. It's probably, Joe, too far north to worry about it becoming a tropical system. So it's basically going to be a non-tropical system. However, being that it's sitting there and we get this fetch from the east off the ocean, it's we're going to pay back some of those the 10 days in a row that we just went through with sunshine.
Yeah, it's well, I hope. I sometimes say how nature likes to balance the checkbook. I hope we're not going to have now 10 days of gloom and doom. No, it's not going to be that way, but it is going to be a bit of an interlude from all of the great weather that we've had. Sometimes when you have a stretch like this, it's kind of tough to take into account the fact that we have to go back to the to the clouds and occasional precipitation, occasional showers. But that's what we're looking at for later on in the week.
By the way, I'm going to switch to another loop here, see if it goes out far enough. The loop I just showed you, uh, for some reason, shut down after just before 4 o'clock this afternoon. So this is the updated satellite loop, and you can see, all the action that's going on, particularly in the west. The deep trough that has dropped, the deep upper low that has dropped into the western part of the U.S. and its associated arm of energy, and the weather front that is sweeping across Utah and New Mexico, and there is a lot of bright white clouds bursting ahead of that, and that's where we've got severe weather tonight. As we check out the latest radar, you can see we've got numerous severe thunderstorm warnings in northwest Texas. They were in eastern New Mexico a little while ago, but now they moved eastward into northwest Texas and into southeastern Colorado. So some solid storms there. Also seeing some solid storms moving into western Nebraska and eastern Wyoming. We have also clusters of showers and thunderstorms in Idaho and in up in Montana. In fact, you could see the rotation here. There's an upper low sitting somewhere in central Idaho. It's probably going to drop a little bit further south before it starts to lift up to the northeast. And we've got patches of rain in the Pacific Northwest from Northern California up the coast through Western Oregon and Western Washington. Meanwhile, here in the East, a couple of people were kind of going off the deep end with this rain, with this potential tropical cyclone. I really kind of thought it was a bit of a big yawn. And if you look at the radar, it's just not that impressive. I mean, I don't think this is going to evolve into something that's going to suddenly produce flooding rains.
Where's the orange? Where's the reds? I don't see any of that.
Yeah, I mean, you still have some flash flood warnings with some small oranges and small reds, if you want to put it that way, in northern North Carolina. It's sort of an east-west band. But yeah, I mean, this, considering what this was trying to do in terms of becoming a tropical system, the problem here is that the surface low is well to the west and south, and there isn't exactly a whole lot of upper support with this. So I just don't think this is going to be a big rain producer overall. And most of the guidance shows that.
One thing that you do have to be aware of, though, over the coming days ahead, as we mentioned, we have had a long stretch of dry weather. 10 days. Tomorrow will probably be dry too, even though it may be rather cloudy. And the one problem is that after such a dry stretch of weather, when you have showers, the first showers that have come in almost 2 weeks, that's going to help interact with all of the oil and the deposits of slick stuff that has been that's on the roadway. And what's going to happen is that as that precipitation falls, it may cause the roads to become a bit on the slick and slippery side. You may have some problems if you're traveling too fast or you're suddenly trying to come to a stop. You may hydroplane. I'm not saying that's going to happen everywhere, every time, every place, but it is one of the things you have to be aware of, that after such a long period of dry weather, when you do get that rain, it does help to bring out or bring up some of the oils that are on the roadways that could cause some slippery conditions.
Two severe thunderstorm watches up tonight. Northeastern New Mexico, and most of that has probably played itself out. Eastern Colorado, western Kansas, western Nebraska, southeast Wyoming. We've got two severe thunderstorm watches. This is where the Storm Prediction Center, they've got a fairly long, though narrow area of slight to enhanced risk that goes from northeastern New Mexico northward up into eastern Montana. We also have a small area of marginal risk along the east coast of Florida, probably from about, let's just say Daytona Beach south to about Miami is where that area is. And, general thunderstorms everywhere else along the Gulf Coast. Also, general thunderstorms being indicated in North Carolina, Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and West Virginia to Maryland and Delaware. Now, tomorrow we go to a marginal risk, again, a very narrow area, the eastern Dakotas and western Minnesota, eastern Nebraska and western Iowa, central Kansas, western Oklahoma, and a small portion of northwest Texas. In the east, it's general thunderstorms from southern New Jersey and the Maryland Pennsylvania line, south to Florida, and then west to just about to Biloxi in Mississippi, and everybody else, not much of anything at all. And day three has no has marginal to slight risk from northern Missouri northward through Minnesota and western Wisconsin. We see a slight risk zone in northern Iowa and through eastern Minnesota and western Wisconsin. And meanwhile, in the east, convective activity from Virginia south to Florida. There's no convective. That's one thing. That's another thing, Joe, that kind of goes against the idea of this being a big rain producer. This is not a setup for convection. It really isn't, especially with this onshore flow.
Right. The onshore flow will make the atmosphere much too stable. I mean, okay, you might get a renegade rumble of thunder or maybe a flash of lightning somewhere, but in general, you're not looking for very much, if any, convection. Whatever we're going to see will probably be light rain or light drizzle or mist, that kind of thing. Nothing where you would have to deal with those heavy duty, super duper showers that sometimes will lead to, well, I mean, like, take, for example, what they had yesterday and last night in Charlotte, North Carolina, 15 inches of rain and all kinds of problems down there. But I don't think we'll have to worry about anything like that in the foreseeable future for us here in the tri state area.
Most of the rainfall amounts that I have up here on the total precip map from the Weather Service digital forecast site, you'll notice that the amounts are rather underwhelming. We're talking a quarter of an inch in New York City. We're talking maybe three-quarters of an inch over eastern Long Island and southeastern New England. Some inch plus amounts in Nantucket, Hyannis, etc. The amounts pick up a bit, three-quarters of an inch down along the Jersey Shore, half to three-quarters of an inch across Maryland and Delaware. North and west of there, notice it just sharply cuts off. Once you go north of Poughkeepsie, for example, there's hardly anything, and even for Poughkeepsie, they only got 300ths. Rainfall amounts uh, in the northern half of Pennsylvania are virtually non-existent. In southern Pennsylvania, we're talking basically a couple of tenths to maybe a quarter of an inch or a third of an inch. Heavier amounts. Now, a lot of this is already fallen. What you see in Virginia and in particularly in North Carolina, because when you look at the radar, just to go back to the radar shot here, if you look at North Carolina, yeah, there's some rain right near the Virginia border, but there really isn't much left going on. So they're pretty much have put down whatever they're going to put down. Maybe some places up near the Virginia state line and some of these heavier downpours wind up getting an additional inch or two on top of the rain that's already fallen. But it's mostly done. And you can see on the wider 7 day forecast view here, New England, very little. The Gulf states, very little. South Florida, up to several inches or more there, particularly in the southern half, the southern third of the state, where we're talking 3 to maybe 6 inches of rain over the next 7 days. Up to a few inches in the central plains to the upper Mississippi Valley. Also covering much of central Montana is an area of heavy rain of several to even some of these yellows here, which are 5 inch amounts, but they're very, very small localized amounts that they're showing up on the map. And that extends up into central Canada and on up into southwest Canada. We're seeing some hefty rainfall amounts. So it's onshore flow. The dry high is, south of Nova Scotia. So we just basically have an easterly flow. It's a long fetch of easterly winds over the ocean, which last I checked is wet and has moisture. So that's sort of feeding into this. And we've got this non-tropical low that's going to form tonight east of Virginia, and it's just going to pretty much sit there off the New Jersey and Delaware coast, just spin around. So there'll be a little bit of rain that I think has probably more impact in your coastal areas than inland. That low just lingers because it can't really get out of the way. It's kind of blocked. There's a big blocking high to the north that's just going to keep it pinned. eventually, and it may not be till Saturday night we start to see the slow drift southward. So that's why we're kind of concerned here that it'll just stay kind of gloomy doomy here in eastern Pennsylvania to southern New England right through Saturday, and then Sunday. It does look like the low finally drifts far enough south, and then a new high starts to build southwestward from eastern Canada, and the flow stays onshore going into next week because the high is going to settle out near Nova Scotia, and the next cold front begins its approach. Now, this is where we start to see the GFS showing a tropical system there. By the way, I think I'm using the 12Z run. I found lately, lately the 18Z runs have been a bit on the squirrely side in the long range, but the 12Z seems to be a little bit more consistent. So I'm going with that. But there you go. This is another run where we see a tropical system being developed in the Caribbean and heading up into the eastern Gulf of Mexico. And of course, this run decided to slingshot it right up the coastal plain, all the way up. But we're talking a week from today where we just had the beginnings of this tropical system. So I would just be really cautious about you're going to see these runs start doing things in the next several days that are going to take this in different directions. But so don't get too worked up over anything in particular because we don't even know what we're going to have yet. But one thing I can say, Joe, is that the upper pattern, which has been a bit disjointed with this Rex block that we've had, is going to start to normalize to some degree next week. The westerlies in Canada are going to drop down. There looks to be some sort of a significant trough that wants to drop down into the Great Lakes and then head into the Northeast, and then another trough that follows it. So, and by the way, the pattern does get awfully blocky um, beyond 10 days, which would suggest that the beginning of October will be on the chilly side.
Well, it is October, and as we get deeper into the fall season, we have to start getting ready for some of these prolonged or protracted spells of coolish weather. I always like cool and dry. I don't like cool and wet. But yeah, that's a pattern that looks like it is trending back toward a cooler run as we get toward the end of the month into early next month. By the way, Joe, I went on Plumes to take a look at the precipitation pattern for the rest of this week. And up until just after midnight, Friday night into early Saturday morning, the plumes are giving New York City 0.68 inches of precipitation. You go to the north, White Plains 0.62, Poughkeepsie 0.35, and at Monticello, and that's a pretty far distance off to the north and west of New York City. But even in Monticello, they have a little bit of precip, just a little, 0.18. So that is the trend. The further north and west you go, the less likely you are of getting into anything significant. I did not look at anything south of New York City, but I'm under the assumption that south of New York, there are going to be places that are probably going to be flirting with or maybe even exceeding an inch of the wet stuff during the latter part of this week.
Yeah, three quarters of an inchish, at least through Friday evening from southern New Jersey southward. I mean, it wasn't anything spectacular.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
The Hurricane Center has already, I guess they must have seen the Joe and Joe Weather Show podcast the last couple of days because we've been sort of mentioning possibility of something, maybe coming out of the Caribbean because there's this big gyre there, and you know how much they watch us on a regular basis. First off, before we go to that, just want to mention that Gordon degenerated into an open trough today, but they have a 60% chance that this could re-strengthen into a tropical storm or a tropical depression or a tropical storm beyond the next 2 days. So it would be from day 3 to day 7. And you can see the track is basically straight north up in the Atlantic, so it's not going to be going anywhere, bothering anybody. But they are acknowledging already in the Northwest Caribbean an area of low pressure could form this weekend in the Western Caribbean. And thereafter, some slow development is possible early next week while the system moves slowly north or northwest over the Northwest Caribbean Sea. So this is the first initial forecast for this, and they got a 20% chance of this developing into a tropical depression or a tropical storm in the next 7 days. So they have at least acknowledged. I think the fact that all three models, be it the GFS, the Canadian, the European, I didn't look at the icon. The icon may not have gone out far enough, but we can certainly give it a look. We'll give it a look see here on the icon, see if it has anything. And that's the 18Z. So we want to go to the 12, which gives us an extra 60 hours. And in fact, it does have, you can see it has this, this gyre of moisture on the Pacific side of Central America as well as on the Caribbean side. And it does form a low over the Yucatan Peninsula, which it emerges into the south central Gulf of Mexico. So that's the icon. The European has, pretty much kind of follows the icon to some extent. It's got a sort of a stretched out low, one low center in the Bay of Campeche, another area of lower pressures north of Cuba. So, but it does show something there. And then you have the Canadian, which was like the GFS, kind of wrapping this up into a hurricane through the Yucatan Channel, moving into the eastern Gulf of Mexico, and then straight north into the Florida Panhandle, and then up the west side of the Appalachians is a pretty powerful looking post-tropical storm. So a lot of variability there going forward, folks. And you would not expect anything different since it is, we are talking the middle to latter part of next week. So we'll we'll be uh we'll be seeing what the next couple of days, the next several days, what the models do with all of this.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what we're looking at now is you and me.
Yes, because
Oh,
we're really
give me a share capability.
um one moment, please. Okay. Uh there you go. You have share capabilities, Mr. Rayo.
All right. I just want to show everybody who's online and might be looking up tonight. I was at Christianopedia making a comment about how enormous the moon looked. Well, there's a good reason for that. The moon always seems to look larger when it's near the horizon. It looks especially large tonight because we are at a full moon and we're also at what is called the supermoon phase. It's at perigee, closest to the Earth, about 221,000 some odd miles away, so it looks a little bit larger and a little bit brighter. However, tonight we have an eclipse. Not the greatest of eclipses, but still an eclipse. The moon is going to move into the shadow of the Earth. And in this particular sequence that you see here, this would be pretty much what the moon looks like right now if you had a view of it. But at 10:12 p.m. tonight, Eastern Time, you're going to see in the upper left-hand corner of the moon, that part of the moon is going to be noticeably darker than the rest as the moon makes contact with the umbra, the dark central shadow of the Earth. And then at 10:44 p.m., we reach the peak of the eclipse. And that's it. I mean, that ain't much of an eclipse. Only 8% of the moon will be in the shadow of the Earth. But still, an eclipse is an eclipse. So we'll get into that at 10:44. And then by 11:16, the moon will have moved clear of the umbra. And pretty much after that, the moon will look the way it normally would look for a full moon for the rest of the night. But if you're out and about, and if the sky is clear or somewhat clear, and if you're able to see the moon, take a look, especially around 10:44. That'll be when the peak of this rather underwhelming eclipse of the moon takes place, with again only 8% of it involved with the dark shadow of the Earth. Incidentally, on March 14th of next year, that's 6 months from now, a little less than 6 months from now, the moon will again move into the shadow of the Earth, but this time in March 14th, it'll be a total eclipse. Much more interesting, much more spectacular. But tonight, the moon just gives the shadow a glancing blow. Again, at 10:44, the peak, 8%. I made a comment, and I hope none of our Jewish or Hebrew listeners are in any way offended by this, but I said to somebody, I said, with the very top of the moon in darkness, right up here, it'll almost look like the man in the moon is wearing a koppel or a yarmulke for a very short interval of time around 10:44 tonight. So there you have it. Tonight's total, not total, partial lunar eclipse.
All right. So you know what? You've got stuff to do. Uh, you got to talk tonight. So we're gonna cut it a little short. We'll save Briller Jeopardy for tomorrow. And we'll, of course, be here tomorrow night at our usual time, 7:35 p.m. Eastern. So everybody have a great night, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye bye.
Au reservoir.